Hi, everybody. Welcome to our latest Global Discussion Forum. Good to see you all. This is on climate change and net zero, challenging the orthodoxy. And let me just start by saying that these GDFs, these Global Discussion Forums, are co-productions between three organizations on different sides of the world: Facts for EU, CIBUK, and Commanding the Narrative. So we span the globe. And today we're delighted to have a knowledgeable, and I think it's fair to say controversial, keynote speaker from Australia, Professor Ian Plimer. Now I'm just going to pass you quickly to my friend and colleague in Sydney, Australia, Stephen.
Well, hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us on all our platforms, CIBUK, Facts for EU, and also Commanding the Narrative. We are doing something a little bit different tonight. We are live streaming on the CIBUK YouTube. So if you are watching us live on that channel, you can contribute to the chat. Just put a chat in there and hopefully we can read out one of your questions or comments as we go along. Now, if you want to actually be on the call, there's a whole bunch of guests here. They're all waiting to ask a question on this Zoom meeting. You need to be a subscriber to either the CIBUK, Facts for EU, or Commanding the Narrative newsletters. Now, visit one of those sites, whichever. You should be on each one of them. You should be on all three if you want, but it's completely up to you which one you choose. Facts for EU and CIBUK. Leigh's the chairman of both those organizations. They're very UK and European centric. Commanding the Narrative is in Australia, but we do a lot of crossover work. So I say sign up to all three, but you need to be on at least one of those lists to get the Zoom link, and you can be part of this live each time we do it. We've got some great guests coming up in the future, and we have a great guest also tonight as well. So yeah, please sign up. Leigh, I'm really excited about this one. I know Professor Ian Plimer, I've interviewed him before. He's a wealth of talent, wealth of knowledge, and a leading expert here in Australia that is pushing back against this climate narrative that we have to deal with all around the world. So Leigh, please take it away.
Yeah, thanks, Stephen. I think this is going to be fascinating, everyone. Having spoken to Ian and dealt with him a few times, I don't think he's going to let anyone down. I don't think you're going to be bored. Let me just tell you about him for those who don't know. Professor Plimer is a fellow of the Australian Academy of Technological Sciences and Engineering, the Australian Institute of Geoscientists, and the Australasian Institute of Mining and Metallurgy. He's also an honorary fellow of the Geological Society of London, a member of the Geological Society of Australia, of the Royal Society of South Australia, and of the Royal Society of New South Wales. I don't think Ian will mind me saying that he has successfully upset some of the establishment media across the world, both in Australia, in the UK, and in the United States. So that alone should make him an interesting figure to listen to. So I hope you'll all give him a warm GDF welcome. I'm now going to pass you back to my colleague in Sydney, Australia, Stephen Tripp from Commanding the Narrative, who will host most of today's proceedings and act as moderator for your questions. Stephen.
That was a tremendous introduction, Leigh. Thank you very much for that. Professor Ian Plimer, the floor is yours. You have 5 minutes to grace us all with your intellect and knowledge. Thank you.
Well, Leigh, thank you for inviting me. And I talk to participants from Adelaide in central southern Australia. I get called controversial, which rankles me a little bit because I speak the truth. And if you speak the truth, you don't have to remember what you said. And I look at the past in our planet and try to work out what has happened in the past. And I'm also interested in the present and the future. And as a scientist, I ask questions, and these questions might be uncomfortable. The question I keep asking is, can you please show me that human emissions of carbon dioxide drive global warming? That question has never been answered. I've asked people at the Polar Institute at Cambridge University in the UK. I've asked leading climate scientists, just give me half a dozen landmark papers that demonstrate that human emissions drive global warming. It's never been done. I get obfuscation, I get abuse, I get criticised, but I've never had an answer to a simple question. So if you can't show that human emissions drive global warming, you have a problem. And you've got an even more serious problem because 97% of all emissions are natural and they don't drive global warming. We don't see any evidence of that. So I look at the past. And Stephen, if you could put on the first slide, in the past, we see that climate always changes and the climate is cyclical and climate changes can be accidental. This is a very well-known diagram showing the last 20% of geological time. 80% of the planet's history is well before that, and that's in the Precambrian. And we have some very good information from the Precambrian. We've had great ice ages in the Precambrian. This is where we had kilometres of ice at the equator and at sea level at times when we had 20% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. We're told that carbon dioxide in the atmosphere drives global warming. So how can you have an ice age when you've got 20% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere? That has never been explained. So all I'm interested in is just to look at the last 20% of time and the black line there, which is a measure of carbon dioxide, atmospheric carbon dioxide, which we measure from proxies. And during this time period, this is when we've had the appearance of multicellular life. And this complex life withdrew carbon dioxide to put into shells, to put into limestone reefs, to put into carbon dioxide-rich minerals such as limestone and dolomite. Those end up as sediments, to put into coals, to put into oil. And what we can see is over the last 500 or so million years, we've actually been sequestering carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. And we've gone from about 0.7%, 0.6% carbon dioxide in the atmosphere to the current level of 0.04%. So we actually have a crisis. It's a crisis in carbon dioxide. If we halved the carbon dioxide content, we would have no plant life on Earth. Then if we look at the blue line, we can see that that is a measure of temperature, and it shows us the 4 ice ages that we've had in the last 20% of time. A short, sharp one in the Ordovician, a very large one, which we have experienced in Australia, and this is a Permo-Carboniferous glaciation, and then one around the Cretaceous and the current ice age. And you can see that for the last 50 million years, temperature has been declining. And what we can also see is there's absolutely no relationship between temperature and carbon dioxide. So we see that from the past, we see it from solution chemistry, we see it from looking at ice cores. The next slide, thanks, Stephen. And what we see with climate is that we have cycles, and these cycles are related to major planetary processes. We pull apart and stitch back together the continents. This changes the carbon dioxide balance in the atmosphere, it changes ocean circulation, it changes atmospheric circulation. And that is a climate driver. Another climate driver is galactic forces. And every 143 million years or so, we have the wrong galactic address. We get bombarded by cosmic rays, we have cloud formation, and we cool down. And then we have a well-known orbital driver of climate every 100,000, 40,000 and 20,000 years. And what has very recently been found, which is not on that table, is a cycle at 2.4 million years. And this is a Martian cycle. I've only seen one publication on this. I'm not prepared to put it on the table until I see this validated. And then we have solar cycles, and these have been driving climate for a very long period of time and continue to drive climate. And then we have some minor cycles, such as a lunar tidal node, which pushes warm water up into the Arctic. And every time that happens, we open up the Northwest Passage. So the bottom line to this is that climate is cyclical, except when it isn't. And when it isn't is when you might get a massive volcanic event, when you have an asteroid impact. So we have to try to work out is anything extraordinary happening in our current climate cycles? Next one, please. And when we look at the last 5,000 years or so, we had a period of warming called the Holocene optimum. We are currently in an interglacial, that is between great cooling periods. We've had a warm period and we've been cooling down, and we've had warm periods during that cooling, Minoan times and Roman times and the medieval warming. So where we are in the current cycle is that we've had a massive ice age that covered the planet down to about 35 degrees south and north. We had ice sheets. Those have now melted about 14,400 years ago. We had a period of warming. We reached maximum warming about 4,000 years ago. And since then, we've been cooling. And within that cooling, we've had spikes of warming and spikes of cooling, such as the medieval warming, such as the Little Ice Age. The next slide, thanks. And so when we look at our fairly recent climates, we see that we've had warm periods, which is in the red or the pink, and cool periods in the blue. So we just get cycles of warming and cooling and warming and cooling. Not one of these cycles I've been talking about has been driven by carbon dioxide. We see no evidence in the past that carbon dioxide drives climate change. There are other major planetary processes doing this. So nothing humans have done to the planet have changed these massive planetary cycles. But we do change climate. If we have excess land clearing, if we have an urban heat island effect, we do change climate, but it's not a global change. And as a result of the scare campaign that human emissions drive global warming, we've put in wind turbines, solar industrial facilities. We start to think about net zero. We start about carbon capture and putting carbon dioxide deep down such that plants are denied food. So from looking in the past, I see that we have climate cycles. I see that not one of these cycles has been driven by atmospheric carbon dioxide. I see that we are in cycles. We can pick our position in the cycle, and the next inevitable global temperature change will be driven by a major planetary cycle. I open myself now to questions.
Professor, that was I mean, tremendous again. You're always so good at conveying this information. My thoughts go straight away to our youth and what they're getting taught in school. I know you recently wrote some children's books to try and get the message to them. Hey, it's not a climate catastrophe like so many of your teachers are teaching you, and so many of the so-called experts and the politicians running around are telling you. Have you had any breakthrough with that attempt? How concerned are you with the youth right around the world, not just here in Australia, not just in the UK, but everywhere in the world that are being confronted with this scare campaign?
Well, it's youth in the West, not in the developing world, that's been confronting with it. I think it's a disease of wealthy people to worry about climate change rather than worrying about where the next meal comes from. I think we are reaping the rewards of dumbing down the education system for half a century. And we now have children who cannot critically think, cannot criticize, don't know where to find valid information, and are so comfortable that they really haven't seen the way the world works. So I think it's a losing battle I'm fighting with children, but I like to put the information out there. The emotional hysteria that children suffer, I think, has been a very cynical abuse. It's been child abuse of young people, getting them frightened about climate. I think that is a serious medical problem. I think when young children use the internet or social media to get information, rather than actually having the grounding in physics and chemistry and mathematics, I think it's quite serious. I think the solution to that is quite simple, and that is that we should thoughtfully do nothing. We should have the information out there for young people to acquire, and ultimately, when economic times in the West get so hard, people will wonder why we went from having cheap, reliable electricity to having very expensive, unreliable electricity. And people will go back to the source and say, well, why did this happen? And we should be very pleased that we're living in one of these periods of time when collectively the community goes absolutely nuts. And that's what's happening now. We had it with the Dutch tulip craze. We're having it now with climate. We're having it with people who will talk about net zero. They'll talk about climate change. And if you ask a very simple question, show me, they can't. And all they do is abuse you. So I think we're at a late stage situation of seeing a significant change, but that will only happen when we've got massive financial pressures in the West. At present, we have people who are building their solar and wind facilities. This is a wonderful industry for people to make a fortune. They don't care about the strength of a nation. They don't care about sovereignty issues. They don't care about children having anxiety. It is a wonderful business. And if you really want to explore the whole of the climate change industry, then just follow the money.
We've got our first question, and just to remind everyone, if you want to ask a question and you're on the Zoom, just hit the reactions button down the bottom and raise hand so I can know that you want to ask a question. But the first person that we've got is Mr. Adam Zara, my co-host on the X Candidates. Adam's also running as an independent for Campbelltown Council. Welcome, Adam.
Hi, Stephen. How you going, mate?
Good, Adam. You have a question or a comment for Professor Plimer?
I do. Professor Plimer, the Petermann Glacier in Greenland has grown almost 10 miles since 2012, despite alarmists predicting its demise. Could glaciers like this growing in size be pointing the direction of global cooling rather than warming?
Well, Adam, it's been a time since we've been on air together. And all I can say is you're not getting any prettier. But glaciers are actually the clue to climate change. Now, I'm going to avoid your question and start with Antarctica and then move to Greenland. In Antarctica, we've got about 150 subglacial volcanoes and geothermal areas. We don't get told about those, and we don't get told that they melt the ice. We also don't get told that in Antarctica, the ice sits in a basin, and for the glaciers to flow, the ice has to move uphill out of those basins and then downhill. That's not driven by temperature. That's actually driven by pressure. And it's a bit like squeezing toothpaste. If you can squeeze toothpaste or ice, it's a very rheologically plastic substance. It will move uphill. If you put a pressure on ice in a short period of time, like hit it with a hammer, it will break. So the ice in Antarctica moves uphill, then it flows down in the glaciers. So a measure of glacial ice loss is not necessarily a measure of temperature. It may well be a measure of what's happening beneath with volcanicity and what is happening beneath with pressure. Now, when we go to Greenland, we've got a very good record from the Greenland ice cores. We've got similar good records from Antarctica, from the Vostok cores, and they show a cyclical climate. They show that we get the ice sheets expanding and the ice sheets contracting. We also have the ice in Greenland in a basin. We also have the ice in Greenland sitting on rocks that emit quite a bit of heat. These are quite uranium, thorium, and potassium-rich rocks. And so we've got heat from beneath as well as atmospheric heat. So the Greenland ice does give us the major cycles that we can see. And these are the Milankovitch cycles of us getting further and closer to the sun. When we're closer to the sun, we have a warmer climate. When we're further away, it's a cooler climate. We also see in the Greenland ice very small perturbations of temperature. And these perturbations are related to the spalling off of large amounts of ice, which we've seen before many, many times. So just to look at a 12, since 2012, looking at that 12-year period of ice is not what we should be looking at. We should be looking at a much larger time period. That's when we can pick out the cycles. That's when we can see the ice sheets wax and wane. And that's when we can start to understand climate. Now, Greenland's ice is fairly recent. And that ice came when South America joined onto North America. We changed the circulation of water in between the Pacific and the Atlantic. We changed the amount of warm water moving into the Arctic, and Greenland got an ice cap. Antarctic got an ice cap about 33 million years ago when South America pulled away from Antarctica and we had a circumpolar current, and no warm water from the tropics could end up in Antarctica, and it froze. So we are currently in an ice age. We are in one of the periods in the history of the planet where we've had an ice age. And during that ice age, we have warmer periods. That's an interglacial. We're currently living in one of those. And we have colder periods, and that's when the ice sheets expand. And just to finish off, in the last glaciation, the ice sheets in the Northern Hemisphere covered Canada, covered Chicago, New York. They were under a couple of kilometres of ice. In Europe, went down as far as the Alps, much of the highlands of Turkey. In China, we had the Great Loess Fields form. In the Southern Hemisphere, we had ice in the Andes. We had glaciers at lower altitude in the Andes in New Zealand. Australia had Tasmania covered by ice, and the highlands of Eastern Australia covered by ice. And inland Australia, we had howling anticyclonic winds giving us the sand dunes. So we've got very good records that we can integrate between Greenland, Argentina, New Zealand, the Loess deposits of China, sand dunes in Australia, and we put together that picture. And the picture always shows us that we have cycles of climate, and we do not see that just because we've had humans on Earth, we've had a change in those cycles.
Thank you for that, Professor Plimer.
Okay, next question's from Jeremy. Welcome, Jeremy. You have a question or a comment for Professor Plimer?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you very much to Professor Plimer for appearing on this and, you know, for me being included. I'm sure that Professor Plimer is aware of the CO2 saturation curve produced by Professor Happer. This shows that when the CO2, when it goes down to about 300 parts per million, there is a very little difference in the temperature between that and it going up to nearly 600 parts per million. Now, this curve is actually copied by the IPCC, who produced a set of a graph of temperature rise against CO2. Now, again, going from 0.2 degrees C at about 450 parts per million down to about 0.1 at 800 parts per million. Now, the point is it possible for experts to compare the two graphs and find out, you know, which one is actually most reliable? Because I believe the Professor Happer one is, and you know, this proves beyond any doubt that increasing CO2 does not add appreciably to the temperature. Thank you.
Jeremy, you're on the money. Those curves have been around for a very long period of time. They're well known in physical chemistry, and Will Happer has used these existing curves. And basically they show that when you increase atmospheric carbon dioxide from 0 to 100 parts per million, it has quite a significant effect on temperature. And as you keep increasing the carbon dioxide, the effect on temperature gets less and less and less. Now, we know that from chemistry. We know it from looking at ancient rocks in the world, where we've had the Earth's second atmosphere was very carbon dioxide rich, yet we didn't have runaway global warming. We actually had ice ages. So the Earth's first atmosphere was hydrogen, helium, ammonia, nitrogen-rich atmosphere. It didn't last very long. And the second atmosphere lasted for billions of years, and that was a carbon dioxide-rich atmosphere. And we are now in the third atmosphere, which is an oxygen-rich and carbon dioxide-poor atmosphere. So we have evidence from chemistry that supports this graph. We have evidence from geology that supports it. And basically it's showing that if you keep increasing the atmospheric carbon dioxide content, it has no effect on temperature. And that's why at 420 odd parts per million carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, if we doubled it, it would have almost an immeasurable effect. So we've picked on the wrong material to be the gas of global warming. The gas of global warming is actually water vapor. But you can't have an international program to ban water vapor. You'd be laughed out of court. We are now picking on methane, and methane, we have almost total saturation now in the atmosphere because methane and water vapor behave very similarly with the energy that they absorb. So you are quite right. The temperature versus carbon dioxide graph, I think, is the key graph. It was one of those that I sent to Stephen, but we had, I think, 4 or 5 had glitches in them and we couldn't show them to you. But that is an absolutely critical graph. You can call it up. It's a very commonly used graph as a line or a bar graph. That's a graph to show that if you keep increasing atmospheric carbon dioxide, it has very, very little effect on the temperature, almost immeasurable. And I'm talking about 0.1 or less degrees Celsius.
Now, if you're watching this and you're thinking to yourself, I really like this, I want to be on a future global discussion forum, and how did all these people get to, be on this and ask wonderful guest questions? You need to be on the CIBUK.org mailing list, or the factsforeu.org mailing list, or the commandingthenarrative.com mailing list. Head to one of those 3 websites. I'll put the link in the show notes afterwards. Sign up and you can be on future global discussion forums. And also for people in this Zoom tonight, just to remind you, if you do want to ask a question, hit the reaction button down the bottom and hit the button that says raise hand, and I'll get to you next. And we have Howard Thompson waiting. Howard, you have a question?
Hi, apologies about my camera not working. I was a borough councillor in 2007 when I used Professor Plimer's book to push back against a council discussion on climate change. We've still got a way to go. My question is, to what extent can political leadership make a change in the discussion? Nigel Farage and the Party Reform UK has made a big point about pushing back against net zero in the UK. And I'm chairman of Conservative Policy Forum in Surrey Heath, trying to inform politicians about this issue and trying to get some more realism there. So second point, does ozone depletion make any difference to atmosphere? I came across a website, ozonedepletion.org, ex-volcanologist in the States, Peter Ward, and I'm just wondering whether ozone is actually a serious contributor.
Well, on your first point, the only good politician is a frightened politician. And
yes,
we need to keep our politicians frightened on the basis that our energy was once reliable and it was cheap. It's now expensive and unreliable. And you're in power, and this has only happened since we've started to put renewables in the grid. So what are you going to do about it? Nigel Farage, a bit like Donald Trump, is not a party animal. He doesn't owe anyone any favours. He hasn't done any deals with people in the past. And he is a true independent. Nigel has been able to do what many party hacks haven't been able to do, and that is ask the right questions. So to get political change, I think we've got to be politically active. I think we have to join political parties. I think we have to start making noise. I think we have to start asking questions that people might find offensive. And I think that will lead to change, and that's certainly what I have done. In terms of ozone depletion, we have a pretty sketchy record of ozone, and ozone depletion may not be a result of human activity putting out chlorofluorocarbons, because we have many volcanoes, especially those in Antarctica, that emit a lot of chlorine gases, fluorine gases, some bromine gases. We also have sea spray that sits on ice, and sunlight on that can release halogens like bromine and chlorine that go into the atmosphere and affect the ozone. And there's a hint of evidence out there showing that ozone in the atmosphere is cyclical and therefore may not be related to human activities. But I've never seen yet any relationship between cyclical ozone and cyclical temperature. So I think my answer to that would be we just don't know enough about ozone depletion. But ozone is a fascinating gas. It's O3, 3 atoms of oxygen, whereas the oxygen we breathe in is O2, 2 atoms of oxygen. And like all geologists, I'm interested in what happens elsewhere in the universe. And there are active programs measuring starlight coming through the atmosphere of exoplanets. And 40 years ago, we didn't know of any planets outside our solar system. We now know of thousands of them. And we're measuring the absorption of the ozone in starlight coming through exoplanet atmospheres to try to find out if there's any ozone there. Because if we find that there's ozone in these atmospheres, then we can say that there's oxygen gas in those atmospheres, and therefore we've got life. So ozone is an absolutely fascinating gas to deal with in exoplanets. So far, we haven't found evidence of respiratory life or oxygen in exoplanets, but ozone is the key to it. So excuse me for that diversion. It's just something that interests me.
Thank you again, Mr. Professor Plimer. We have our chairman, Leigh. You have a question?
Yeah, Ian, I've got a pretty simple question for you because I'm a pretty simple kind of guy. You've answered some very technical questions so far, but to keep everyone hooked and interested, my interest is in how we get the messages out to the public, and the public are hearing a very different story to yours. So what part of the reason for that is because almost every scientist out there profoundly disagrees with you. My question to you, therefore, is very simple. Why?
Well, two things, Chairman Leigh. To get the message out there is not easy because the media like sensational stories. They like to frighten people. They have a political agenda, and they will not give people like me much airtime. I do get airtime. Sky in Australia gives me good airtime. Occasionally, I will write something in the Australian, and I write books. But in effect, I'm not getting the message out there because there's a black ban on getting the message out. In terms of people disagreeing with me, I actually don't care. Science doesn't work on a vote of hands. Science doesn't work on whether you agree with people. Science is married to evidence. Now, we once had agreement on phlogiston. We once had agreement in more recent times that the atom was the smallest unit that we had in the universe. Then it became subatomic particles like the proton, the neutron, and the electron. And then it became even smaller particles. So we've had many periods of time when there's been a consensus. The consensus was once that we were the center of the universe. We know that's not the case. So I'm not particularly concerned about people who disagree with me because we have a large number of mathematicians, physicists and chemists and biologists who call themselves climate scientists. They could not exist without the largesse of governments. I would argue that many of them are eminently unemployable and that I'm a threat to their employment. I'm a threat to their strutting around with peacock feathers. I'm a threat to the main game. So again, this is a normal situation. And I've found in my career that sitting on the Australian, German and Swedish research councils, that it was often the lone scientists out there who made the significant discoveries, not the great committees where they agreed with each other, not the teams. And so I don't have a problem being one of the thousands of scientists out there that disagree with the popular paradigm. I'm not a lone wolf. There was the Oregon Accord where I think it was 37,000 people, scientists, signed a document saying, no, we think the human-induced global warming is codswallop. So I'm not alone. I'm not a lone wolf. I don't get the media publicity that the other side gets, but ultimately, when times get tough, people will go back to the source.
Professor Plimer, I'm going to jump in with a question. You're talking about not being able to get your message across, and I think it's evident that we've lost the argument when it comes to try and push back against this narrative of global boiling. Like, it's ridiculous how they can come out and call it global boiling. I mean, but we have governments, specifically in the Western world, moving our energy systems to unaffordable, unreliable, environmentally destructive, intermittent energy, otherwise known as renewables. There's a lot of environmental destruction that comes along with that, whether it be, high voltage transmission lines carving through grazing land or agricultural land, offshore wind farms. I was down at a rally in the Illawarra last Sunday. The offshore wind farm there is going to be over 1,000 square kilometers. That's bigger than the size of Singapore and New York City. I did some further research this week. There's going to be one in Gippsland that is 15,000 square kilometers. We have renewable energy zones in the middle of New South Wales that are over 20,000 square kilometers. The amount of land that is going to be consumed with these wind, solar, high voltage transmission lines, pumped hydro, batteries, the list goes on. Where are the greenies? I mean, where are the green? If someone tried to build a footpath and that was going to knock over a tree, that'd be up in arms. Yet they're bulldozing and in some cases blowing up the top of ridges in far north Queensland and other parts of Australia, and I'm sure in the UK and other parts of the world as well. Why are the greenies not pushing back against this stuff?
Well, you pushed many issues there. Global boiling's the first one. I think the global boiling is just so ridiculous that people just roll their eyes. But I think the reason why that is mentioned is that there is now some concern that we are getting a bit of traction, that people are not easily scared. And I think it's evidence that the other side are losing the arguments, and they're losing it because of what's exactly you mentioned, that rural areas are being destroyed by thousands of acres of solar panels, thousands of acres of wind turbines. They slice and dice birds and bats offshore. They affect whales and slice and dice birds. You can't see the carnage because it drops into the water. These are ugly. These are displacing perfectly good farming lands with inefficient, unreliable energy. Your solar panels covering prime agricultural land are just not going to give electricity at night. It's becoming obvious. Now, the average city person is not affected by this, but occasionally they might go to rural areas and see the absolute damage that's being done. So the green movements are not concerned about the environment. They're not concerned about the climate. They're concerned about matters of power, and they want power over you. Some of them are elected, most are unelected. And they deal with so many other issues. They're dealing with issues of Palestine, issues of diet. So they have started a movement to control your life, to control every aspect of your life. And I think the green movement has moved away from being an environmental movement. And I think the more we show their hypocrisy and the more we talk about this in public, the better it is.
Mr. Adam Zara has another question. Adam?
Yep. So have politicians, climate alarmists fused anthropological climate change with anthropological environmental change?
Perhaps we are getting change due to human activity, such as land clearing for growing crops and for pasture. We are getting changes in our waterways due to human activity. But I don't think it's a confusion. I think it's a general attack on anything associated with the modern world. And if there is confusion, then it's deliberate. And this confusion is to make it very difficult for the average child to work out the difference between climate change and, say, environmental activity. We have to remember that these green groups were established as tree-hugging groups, and these green groups had admirable causes. If they wanted to be logical and continue this cause, then they would be strongly supporting pumping carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere, because this is plant food. This is for the trees. So there's an element of ignorance, there's an element of hypocrisy, there's an element of deliberately making people concerned, and there's an element of deliberately making confused. Because you have to remember that the average person has virtually no scientific knowledge. The scientific knowledge of a politician is that of scientific ignorance. They're equivalent to someone who can't read or write in their scientific knowledge. So it is very easy to confuse people, and it's very easy to confuse people if you use technical terms and if you have hysteria with religious zeal attached to it.
We have our first comment in the YouTube chat. Silence is Golden says, absolutely right. If there is no fear, the narrative starts to crumble. So just remember, if you are watching us live on YouTube, on the CIBUK YouTube, you can comment and in the chat and ask a question or make a comment. But first, in the Zoom, we have Chris. Welcome, mate. You have a question for Professor Plimer? You're on mute, mate. You might just have to unmute yourself first.
Professor, firstly, is it true that the IPCC has never actually said that we have a climate alarm? They've been much more measured than that, and this whole idea that we have a climate alarm is something that the press have beaten up. That's what I've heard said. I'm not sure if that's entirely true. Can I just have another question, and then I'll be done? Is it also true that it's only really the developed world that seem to believe this rubbish? Clearly, when you look at what other countries actually do, the Chinese and the Indians, for example, who between them emit more than 50% of the carbon into the atmosphere, they're hell-bent on building coal-fired electricity stations, etc., etc. They don't seem to be concerned about the future of the planet in that respect. And lastly, I'm intrigued as to how this all got going in the very first place. How come the world has gone mad, if I can put it like that? So thank you.
Okay, starting with the first one, the IPCC put out reports every now and then, and these reports are divided into two. There's one very voluminous report, which is the science, and the latest one is 4,900 odd, or nearly 4,000 pages in that. No journalist has read that. No journalist wants to read it. No journalist has the skills to read it. And those reports, those scientific reports, are very measured. And they are certainly not claiming that there's a climate catastrophe. They're certainly documenting that there is change going on. And we argue about the origin of the change. So the non-catastrophist version is written in thousands of pages of science. Now, that science is not science done by the IPCC. They have trawled the literature and picked out scientific papers that fulfill their brief. There's a lot of science out there that the IPCC doesn't look at and doesn't record and doesn't acknowledge exists. And this is science which shows the opposite to what the IPCC is promoting. Now, in order to make life easy for journalists and politicians, they then have a summary for policymakers. And this is has very little relationship to the scientific reports. This summary for policymakers screams about catastrophe and how we're all going to fry and die. And this is written for newspapers to be very shrill. It's written for governments such that the UN's IPCC can keep getting funded. And it is absolutely unrelated to the science. In terms of the developed world, then the developed world, I think, is suffering from residual Christianity, where we have guilt, we pay penance, we buy indulgences. We have a holy book, the IPCC volumes, which very few people have read, and it's the same with any other holy book, very few people have read them. And this is the new religion. And this is a religion like other religions, which is wrapped in guilt and is wrapped in a power structure. And so we have been drinking the Kool-Aid, and we have accepted this as a new religion, and this is concurrent with the collapse of Christianity in Western Europe and many Western countries, while the developing world is very different. The developing world is very much aware that in the West, we've had our industrial revolution, and that brought people out of grinding poverty into the comfortable state they have now. People don't have to worry about starving. They don't have to worry that a weather event will end up in their children dying or starving. And we cannot deny China or India to do exactly what we've done, and that is industrialize by using the cheapest, most easily available fuel that's around, and that's coal, by burning that to give out energy, which we can use to drive a steam engine to generate electricity, or to drive other machinery, or to make various chemicals and plastics, etc. We can't deny them that. So we are having a massive growth in carbon dioxide emissions from China and India. For the purpose of climate, they're regarded as a developing world. For the purpose of trade, they're regarded as an advanced country. So the developing world and the developed world are two different games. And the developing world, such as China, is very happy to sell silly Western countries their wind turbines and their solar panels, because they get it both ways. They have the trade and the wealth they generate from exporting the solar panels and the wind turbines, and they weaken the Western country, who are getting off coal, getting off nuclear, and going for unreliable renewables. And we have to remember that the only thing renewable about renewable energy are the subsidies. They just keep coming. And energy, if it were not subsidised, we'd have a very different story. So how did the whole show get going? I'm not quite sure about this. I read stories that incriminate Margaret Thatcher or Bernd Bolin in Sweden. It goes back to scientists asking genuine questions, like, I wonder if the emissions of carbon dioxide from burning coal will actually change the global climate or the atmosphere. These are valid scientific questions to ask. So I can't really tell you how the whole show started, but it was interesting that in the 1970s we were hearing that we're going to be approaching an ice age and we're going to have mass famines and depopulation. And the very same people that told us this were telling us a decade later that we're going to fry and die, and we'd be very sinful. And if you pay out your indulgences, then we'll make sure you don't fry and die.
Thank you.
Now, Chris, you answered, asked some fantastic questions there, but I do need to crack the whip. Leigh told me to crack the whip tonight. Please just ask the one question for everyone now. There's a lot of people with their hands up. There's actually even some questions in the chat. I want to get through them as quickly as possible. We've got time, so just one question. If you have multiple questions, you can go to the back of the line and ask the next one. So next we have Rudy. Trying to push through some of these questions quickly. Rudy, you have a question for Professor Plimer.
Yes, I mean, I'd like to come back to the point about HAPA that we were discussing with the estimates that HAPA came up with, where I think he said in the atmosphere, if you double the carbon dioxide, it might increase the temperature by around about 0.75 degrees centigrade, which isn't enough to excite anyone. And for those of you who follow the IPCC work and their models, I mean, the way they turn the 0.75 centigrade into something frightening is by invoking a lot of positive feedbacks. You know, the idea being that you warm the environment a little bit and it's like a fuse and the whole thing will just catch fire. There was a lecture recently by John Clauser on the subject of feedbacks, and he identified that the most likely feedbacks in the system were really going to be negative rather than positive, so that instead of multiplying the 0.75 by a number, you had to divide it by a number. And I was just wondering whether Ian was familiar with that work and what he thought about feedbacks such as cloud feedbacks that might actually cool the planet very effectively in response to any small initial warming by carbon dioxide.
Well, Rudy, that's a very good question. If I walk out of this room, the temperature change will be greater than 0.75 degrees Celsius. If I stand up, the temperature change would probably be about 0.4 degrees Celsius. If I go outside, the temperature change would be about 12 degrees Celsius. One doesn't die from a very slight temperature change. And it's only if you can engineer the numbers, as Will Happer suggesting, that you can get a scenario that might be frightening. Now, the feedbacks are quite interesting, and I think Happer and Clauser and quite a few others have been dealing with this. The feedbacks, and you mentioned that very important word, clouds. There is huge uncertainty about the feedbacks, and that uncertainty is on clouds. Clouds can actually contribute to warming, they can contribute to cooling, and we don't really know how the clouds behave to give us negative or positive feedbacks. So from what I've read, and I'm not an atmospheric physicist, but from what I've read, it is the cloud feedback that is absolutely vital for determining whether we're going to get warming or cooling. And that has not been resolved. And like a lot of issues in science, there are a number of views.
Okay, now we have a very special guest, Catherine McBride, who was the speaker during the first Global Discussion Forum. This should be a good meeting of the minds. Catherine, welcome. You have a question for Professor Plimer? Are you on mute? You'll have to just come mute yourself.
Yeah. Okay, I'll mute myself and turn around so you can see who I am. That fantastic and thank you so much, Professor Plimer, for not just this talk, but to keep talking and all your books, because not enough people are hearing this. And my question was sort of answered before about how it began, but the thing that I'm not quite sure is how they made people think a warmer climate would be a worse climate. Because I moved from Australia to the UK about 35 years ago, and I've always thought a little bit of global warming would really improve this place. And at the time, they were all talking about it, and then they stopped talking about it because the weather went back to normal. And we've also seen 2 years ago, we had a very hot summer in the UK, which again, every time we have one hot summer, the BBC gets all excited about global warming. But if you look at our production of wheat, and all of our yields were much, much higher because we finally had warm weather. This year, apparently we've had the hottest May on record, and that's because the nighttime temperatures were warmer because of all the cloud cover. So they've gone back to trying to convince people that warmer will somehow be worse when it's been the coldest, wettest summer I can remember here. But anyhow, well, so that's my question. How did they convince us that warm is bad? You know, when you're sitting in Adelaide, and I'm sure in the winter in Adelaide, it's probably hotter than it's been in the summer in England.
Well,
and
thank
you look like
Catherine.
You're still alive. You're still alive. How did you do that in that hot weather?
Alive. Well, thank you for that. We are creatures of the Rift Valley, and we are creatures of warmer weather. Where do people in the Northern Hemisphere go for their holidays? They go to a warmer climate. They don't go to the Arctic. We know from scientific studies that have been done, and one has been done on 34 million deaths, that there's about a 20-fold more fatalities or deaths from climate in cold weather than in warm weather. The cold kills you. The warm weather rarely does kill you, and it's about 20 to 1. So we've got some very, very good medical statistics on that, and I go into those in my book, Green Murder, where I look at all of these statistics, many of which come from the dreaded UN, to just show us that we are living in better times. We are living in the very best times ever to be a human on planet Earth. We have many stories in our culture about Jack Frost, about people suffering in cold weather. We don't have those stories about people in warm weather. We have very good information on agricultural yields. We have very good information on the relationship of fertilizers, carbon dioxide, and agricultural yields. We have had a massive change in this planet since the Industrial Revolution, because we can create fertilizers, we can feed people, we've had a slight increase in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we get even greater yield increases when it's warm. So I don't know how people have fallen for this. We all like the warmer weather. The colder weather is not very pleasant. But the one important thing to remember is that we humans can adapt. We live on the ice sheets. We live at altitude. We live at sea level. We live in the deserts. We live in the tropics. We have adapted to live right across the planet Earth. And because of that, we shouldn't worry about a slight temperature change. We can also do what a lot of plants and animals can do, and that is we can migrate. So if it's too hot for us, we just go to a higher latitude. If it's too cold for us, we go to a lower latitude. And that's what a lot of people do in this country. They retire into low latitude areas in Queensland. This is what people in the Northern Hemisphere do. They go to Spain or Italy or Malta or somewhere for their holidays. So the whole story about how warm weather is dangerous is totally and absolutely fallacious.
Got a question on the YouTube chat. Silence is golden, and you did bring up this before, but I think it's worth repeating. The Middle Ages warming period, which can you talk a little bit about that, because obviously it creates a problem for the climate narrative.
Well, we had Michael Mann try to destroy that medieval warming, and even if he was successful, then we've got the Roman warming. He didn't try to destroy that. So we've had periods in Roman times and medieval times when the average temperature has been about 5 degrees warmer than now. So how do we work that out? Well, we work it out from where people grew crops. The Romans grew grapes in northern Yorkshire. They had olive trees up as far as Bonn in the Rhine Valley. They kept good records of their salt harvests. We know that in the medieval warming, that sometimes in Europe, we had 2 harvests a year. There was so much excess wealth generated that money went into the great monasteries and the cathedrals and the universities. So we have extremely good historical records, which then we can look at the proxies and say, okay, this great period of booming in historical times was when we had warmer weather. The proxies are telling us that. So if you can create another proxy like Michael Mann's tree rings to destroy that, then you're killing one of the key arguments that is used to show that human-induced global warming is nonsense. Now, we know that in warmer times, we are wealthier, we live longer, we have less political trouble, we have fewer wars, we have more children that survive till adulthood. We are currently living in one of those times, and this modern warming time is a time which has led to population increase. It's led to a great increase in wealth. For example, in the time of Jesus, most people were poor. We now, in terms of wealth, are 30,000 times better off than people in the time of Jesus. So those warm periods of the Greek-Roman times, of the medieval times, and the current times of the modern warming since about 1850, have been where we've had great advances in humans, great increases in population, great increases in wealth and health. And so the killer for any argument about human-induced global warming is to look at history. You can look at 1,000 years of history, 2,000 years, or as I look at thousands of years. I like integrating the history, the archaeology, and the geology. And if you look at the past, you see that we've had periods of change where temperature rises and falls have been far more rapid than anything measured today. And so you have to ask, well, what part of the modern warming is natural and what part may well be due to humans? And that question's never been answered.
To get a little bit political, today it was a overcast day here in Sydney. The wind wasn't blowing, and lo and behold, I had a blackout here in the Northern Beaches. It only lasted for about 2 hours, but it's an inconvenience. Then my dad came over and he told me, yes, he's had 2 blackouts in the inner west of Sydney. I've heard it also happening elsewhere as well. It seems like these brownouts are starting now. It's been predicted for a long time by sensible people that understand the electrical grid. They said, well, it's inevitable that these brownouts will happen. How do you feel? I know this is a very Australian-orientated question, but the coalition opposition under Pete and Dutton has come out promoting nuclear energy. They're going to take nuclear energy to the next election, and the Australian public will get the chance to vote on it. I know the UK have probably been using nuclear energy for a long time, and Australia is the only country in the G20 that doesn't have nuclear energy. Were you excited by that policy? How do you feel about a potential shift to nuclear energy here in Australia?
Well, you've broken your own rules. You've asked a couple of questions. The first part is load shedding. The electrical providers don't have enough energy for everyone, so they load shed. And this load shedding is done generally in colder times or very hot times, times when there's a lot of cloud, times when there's no sunshine. In terms of nuclear, Australia exports 6,000 tonnes of uranium and yellowcake each year. We have the third biggest resources of uranium in the world, and we don't create any fuel rods. We don't beneficiate this. We sell off the yellowcake. These are uranium oxides and hydroxides. We sell off those to other countries. We have had 2 nuclear reactors in Australia. The first one went in 1959, just south of Sydney, and that has been replaced by another reactor, a soft neutron reactor, the opal reactor, and that is used to create medical isotopes. That's used to for a lot of scientific research, to look at structural steel, etc., etc., etc. So we already have a nuclear industry in Australia. Even though we're a G20 country not generating electricity from nuclear energy, we already have a nuclear industry. And if we are going to, as both sides of Parliament want us to have nuclear submarines, then we're going to have a nuclear industry to support this. And we are going to have spent fuel, and we have to put that somewhere. So we are conflicted, we are schizophrenic when it comes to nuclear energy. And I think the reason why Australia doesn't have nuclear power in the grid is that we are so well off. We've got such good coal deposits. We have thousands of years of coal in Australia. We have thousands of years of gas and millions of years of uranium. And we are just so well off with top quality Gondwana coals that we haven't needed to use nuclear. Whereas other parts of the world, which are more populated and don't have our good quality coals, have gone to nuclear. So I think the reason why we haven't gone nuclear is that we've had a movement start in the 50s that has been anti-nuclear, and they've been able to get away with it because we haven't had power shortages, because we've had such good quality, cheap, coal-fired power coming into Australia.
Don't have anyone with their hand up at the moment, so I might start signaling people out. Anthony Carr, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, a quick one. I haven't got the graph in front of me, but it shows the demand for electricity in Germany, and the amount of that demand is being met by the solar and wind. And they've spent a huge amount of time, money, building up huge solar and wind establishment with bugger all increase in the actual output of electricity. That's just a comment.
Well, Anthony, to add to your comment, Germany was a great industrial country. Yeah. A lot of that industry now is moving out of Germany because they cannot get cheap, reliable electricity to run industry, and no developed country can run on sea breezes and sunbeams, and Germany showed that. They get a lot of electricity from nuclear, from France, from hydro in Norway, from coal in Poland. So when Germany tries to go down the path of using sunbeams and sea breezes, they failed. And they're now resurrecting some of their shut nuclear plants and their coal-fired power stations. They have some very large brown coal deposits, which are not a very efficient way of generating electricity. And they also have black coal resources, especially in the former East Germany. So Germany has realised that they can't run an industrial economy on sea breezes and sunbeams, and is going back to what is tried and proven.
Would you support the resurrection of coal-fired generation? Because as I understand it, it's cheaper.
Yes, I very much would. I think we've got to have a blend of power in the grid, and some of this is coal-fired, some of it would be nuclear, some of it would be hydro, some of it would be gas, and with an isolated phone box in the desert, you might actually have solar power, and with railway signals in the desert, you might actually have a bit of wind power, but solar and wind cannot keep an industrial economy running. Now, I know there are many listeners from the UK and elsewhere, but Australia doesn't get a high rainfall. We don't have a topography where we can have a large hydroelectricity scheme such as we have in South America or other parts of the world where we've got high rainfall and a very steep topography. So hydro is not a good choice in Australia. Our coal is very good quality coal. We have in the past created very cheap electricity, such as in the Gippsland Basin of Victoria. We were creating electricity at 3 to 5 cents a kilowatt hour. It's about 8 times that now because we rely on renewables. So my argument would be we might get to the end of life of a coal-fired power station, and let's replace it on that site, maybe with a nuclear reactor, maybe with a high energy and efficient coal-fired power station. But I can't see the point of demonising coal-fired power stations. You have to be able to demonstrate that if you want to close down the emissions of a coal-fired power station, you have to show that those emissions drive climate change. That's never been shown. You have to show that those emissions are dangerous for humans. They're not. You're emitting plant food, but that's very beneficial for humans. So my view is that you've got to have a blend of energy in this country. Coal is absolutely fundamental. In the state that I live in, South Australia, we have coal deposits that are rather low calorific value, fairly high in water, and so we're the obvious place to have nuclear. But in New South Wales and Queensland, they're the obvious places for black coal. In Victoria, the obvious place for brown coal. Western Australia, the obvious place for gas, because the coal deposits are small and it's not good quality coal. So I don't think you can have a blanket rule saying, oh, we're going to rule out coal, we're going to rule out gas or nuclear. It just depends upon the geology of the area that you are in.
Mr. Leigh Evans, you have a question?
Yeah, well, it's more of a general comment, really. We've got some great people on this call, and I just want to encourage them to ask now whilst you can. We've got, just in terms of the meeting management, but about 30 minutes more for questions to Ian, to Professor Plimer, and grab them while you can, because this is a fantastic opportunity. And the recording of this is going to go out to a very large number of people. So if you've got questions, now is the time to put up your hand. I can see that my friend David Seelig is already one of them. But let's get as many questions in as we can in the remaining half an hour or so. And then just a heads up to Ian, a bit unfair on you, but I'm going to have a challenge for you at the end of this based on what you've said. I have a low boredom threshold. You haven't bored me once. Whether you're right or wrong, it's been fascinating so far. I'm looking forward to the rest of it. My challenge to you
is the challenge to bore you.
No.
Is that your challenge?
No, I have a challenge that might be very interesting for you, but the audience is going to have to wait just a little bit. And then I'm going to throw it at you for your response live on air.
Thank you.
All right, let's jump to David. You have a question or a comment? You have to unmute yourself, David.
Yeah, I've done it now, yeah. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you loud and clear.
Okay. Yeah. Ian, would you agree with me in suggesting that the origin of net zero and that all the nonsense that's gone with that goes back to Professor Stephen Schneider of Stanford University, who in 1987 said if we can blame the internal combustion engine on the world's climate problems, we can destroy the Western economy. What he was saying, of course, was the emanation of CO2 in that context. Would you agree with that?
Yes, I would. The internal combustion engine for people in the West is freedom. It means that you can get up and go somewhere whenever you want to. So it is also an attack on freedom. Schneider is well quoted on that quote that you gave us, but the net zero is an interesting concept because basically that argues that we've all got to turn around and die. And in the green movement, there's a twinge of eugenics and genocide going through that movement all the time. Net zero basically means that we do not emit any carbon dioxide, so we don't have a modern world, and we might not even be able to breathe out carbon dioxide. Now, I've done some calculations on net zero, and I published it in the Spectator Australia, and we emit per capita in Australia a significant amount of carbon dioxide compared with you in the UK. You emit less per person, and that's because we have a lot of smelters, and those smelters are converting concentrate into metal, and that's because of our big mining industry. Now, if you do the sums and work out the amount of carbon dioxide that we Australians emit, and then the amount of carbon dioxide that is used as plant food by our grasslands, by our rangelands, by our forests, by our crops, and even our continental shelf, where we're putting the carbon dioxide into our coral reefs, we emit about 1/10 of the carbon dioxide that we absorb. So we are already at net zero in this country, and we should go to wealthy countries like Bangladesh and say, well, pay up, we're doing our bit, and you're emitting all that carbon dioxide or methane from your rice paddies, which is converted to carbon dioxide and water vapor. So the whole net zero argument is absolute codswallop. The whole argument doesn't look at the balance and cycles of carbon and cycles of water vapor in the atmosphere. And this whole movement has been an anti-human movement. It's been a movement which is to attack and destroy wealth in the West and to take away people's freedoms. So I think you're absolutely on the money.
Thank you for your question, David. Next one up is Don Briggs. Welcome, Don. You have a question?
First, I'd like to say what a stimulating conference this has been. Absolutely tremendous to listen to. Thank you, Leigh, and thank you, Professor Plimer. My question to Professor Plimer is, does he believe that the eccentric orbit of the Earth has anything to do around the sun, has anything to do with any influence on climate change? It lasts about 15,000 years, I think.
Yeah, thank you for the question. I don't like to use the word believe. That's a word of religion and politics. In science, I like to use words like evidence. Now, there is evidence that we've got orbital eccentricity. This has been measured. It was measured more than 100 years ago. And there are 3 orbital eccentricities. One when we go from a circular to a slightly elliptical orbit. That's about every 100,000 years. We then have a change in the Earth's axis of rotation, and that eccentricity is about every 40,000 years. And we've got another one when we wobble like a top, and that's about every 20,000 years. Now, we can measure those. We can also see these cycles in the past when we're looking at the temperature that we can measure from ice sheets and the atmospheric temperature that we can measure in the past from air that's trapped in ice. So, yes, we have an eccentric orbit, and if you really want to get down to the basics of climate, then the driver of climate on planet Earth is the sun. Sometimes we're closer to the sun, sometimes we're further away with our eccentric orbit, and adding to that are secondary drivers such as our tectonics, such as galactic influences, etc. But our distance from the sun and the amount of energy that the sun pumps out, which changes, drives climate. And I want to be able to see evidence. If I'm going to accept the global warming hypothesis, I want to see evidence that we are living in extraordinary times. I'm a patient person. I'm waiting for that evidence.
Thanks for that. Thanks for that, Don. Good question, mate. Now, next question's up is Adam Zara again. Now, the first time that we interviewed Professor Plimer on our Ex-Candidates podcast, Adam and I barely got a word in because Adam was asking 1,000 questions at once. He's more subdued tonight. But Adam, you got another question?
Yeah, well, I have to wait in turn this time. Normally, I just jump in over the top. So that's why. But Professor Plimer, I like coal. You know I like coal. I know that in the 70s and 80s, it generated the cheapest energy that we had. you know, basically across the world. But, you know, I've been in the political game for 4 years now, and this argument I'm really tired of this argument about energy and where we're going to get it from. I feel like fake renewables is just a waste of money. Why not just go nuclear? We've got thousands and thousands of years of nuclear. If we go to the 4th or 5th generation nuclear reactors, we've got billions of years of nuclear powered generation. Why not just pull the pin in the argument and go, that's it, let's go nuclear, rain, hail or shine, it's going to work, great base load. It might be a little bit more expensive, say, than a coal-fired power station, but why not just bite the bullet and cut the costs and not worry about it in the future? End the debate. Done.
Well, Adam, you haven't been subdued. This is your third question. Hydrocarbons, and that's coal and oil and gas, they produce about 6,000 chemicals that we use in society. For example, we're living in a society where we depend upon steel, and for steel, we need coal. We're in a society where, excuse me, where we need fertilizers. I might sneeze after every point. And for that, we need gas, hydrocarbon gases. We need cement to make concrete. So we're living in a society where steel is fundamental, and we have to use coal for that. Gas is fundamental. Plastics, all sorts of chemicals that come out of that are fundamentals. Fertilizers are fundamentals. We are living in a society where we cannot banish coal and other fossil fuels. We have to use them for other areas of industry. So, for example, from coal, not all coal goes into burning to create steel, to create steam, to drive a turbine, to create electricity. Coal chemicals have been used for a long period of time, so we can't banish coal. We have to use coal for many, many purposes. I also think there's a very good reason for having a blend of nuclear and coal. We had a period of time in Australia in a drought, and we didn't have much water for the cooling towers in coal-fired power stations. That was a very good argument to have gas and or nuclear, and we didn't have the water for hydro. So I think the safest and most secure energy form is a blend of energy. The only argument, therefore, we have is a proportion of nuclear to coal, to gas, to hydro, to wind, to solar.
Great question, Adam, and also a fantastic answer from Professor Plimer. Got another question from Silence is Golden on the YouTube chat. Silence says, I am led to believe the current readings of CO2 in the atmosphere is around 400 parts per million. If this falls below 200 parts per million, plant life begins to die. Is the current level of 400 parts per million dangerously low?
That's a good question. My answer is yes. Patrick Moore, who was one of the founders of Greenpeace, has also argued that we should be burning as much coal and gas as possible to put carbon dioxide into the atmosphere to feed the plants. Now, we have had an evolution of plants as we've had a decrease in carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and we had the change from C3 to C4 plants. C4 plants, things like corn, maize, etc. We've already seen an adaptation of plants because we've been decreasing carbon dioxide from 0.7% 520 million years ago to 0.04%, and that's your 400 parts per million. So I think we are quite critically low. One of the slides that I sent you, Stephen, was actually looking at the last 50 million years of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and one of the ones that didn't appear. And we've been decreasing in carbon dioxide for a long period of time in the atmosphere. We've had a slight increase over the last 150 years or so, but it's nothing to worry about. But we've had a long-term decrease, and we are now threatening plant life. And it's quite right. If we went to half of 400 parts per million, plants would struggle. Now, we've seen that before. We've seen it during very intense ice ages where we get to 200 parts per million plants and we lose a lot of vegetation. So my argument is that we have a crisis in carbon dioxide. Not that we're emitting it, we just don't have enough of it in the atmosphere.
I wish the kids in school knew all about this sort of stuff, but they're not even taught photosynthesis anymore, apparently. But...
Well, I don't think the teachers know it. And the first thing they learn in school science is about how evil carbon dioxide is. They don't learn the most common reaction of plants that they should learn, and that is photosynthesis. And that is carbon dioxide plus water plus sunlight, and you get complex molecules and sugars in plants. And you do not get plant growth without carbon dioxide, water, and sunlight.
All right, let's go to some rapid fire. Anthony Carr, you got another question, mate?
Sorry, very quickly. I put up a graph in the comments, which was the thing I was referring to when I asked my question to Ian. Or if you go to the comments, and you'll see a graph there, and click on it, and it'll come up on the screen. It'll show you a large increase in the installed capacity of wind and solar in Germany, but bugger all increase in the actual output of electricity from this huge increase in installed capacity. Shows you it's a total waste of time and money. Basically.
Well, Anthony, if you double the number of windmills, you don't double the amount of electricity when the wind doesn't blow.
Exactly. Yes,
that's simple.
I thought that's a very good graph. That was I dug it up while you know.
Well, thank you for that.
Yeah, it's a good graph. Okay.
I'll bring that one up in a second. Before I do, we'll just go to Howard. Howard, you have another question?
Hi, yes. You're absolutely right that we need a mixture of power sources. One thing that concerns us in the UK is the extent to which we have immigration, both legal and illegal, and a lot of that is economic migrants. And if you look at the whole of Africa from space, you know, there's virtually no electric light pretty much anywhere other than capital Egypt, etc. So rather than being dependent on oil, we need to find sources of energy that can actually make places more prosperous. And we're never going to be able to generate enough of that from oil sources. So I'm in favor of nuclear that can be supplied across the planet, and particularly thorium.
Well, we've already got nuclear reactors in Africa, and I've been to the one in Cape Town. That's a very interesting question, because in Africa there are quite considerable coal deposits, and there is no way that you are able to finance a coal-fired power station in some African countries. So we are, by green policies, knowingly keeping destitute Africans in poverty. And it's no wonder they become economic immigrants, because we are driving this. I have some concerns about undeveloped countries having nuclear power, but we know from history that the more energy there is, then the wealthier a country becomes. And the wealthier a country becomes, the fewer children they have. So part of this immigration is driven by poverty. It's also driven by economics, and it's also driven by people abandoning countries which are absolutely and totally corrupt.
Thank you, Howard, for your question. Good question, mate. Chris, you've got another question. Thank you.
Yes, Professor. These climate nutters are obviously gunning for our fossil fuels, but they also seem to be gunning for our agricultural sector as well. You know, cows, for example, emit a whole lot of carbon dioxide. How much does livestock, etc., carbon dioxide do they emit into the atmosphere? I don't know if we know that or not. Secondly, how successful has that campaign against agriculture been so far?
Again, I refer to an article that I wrote in the Spectator Australia on this matter. You can do the sums, which I've done on cattle, and if you have a certain amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, you can actually do a carbon cycle on this, and that carbon dioxide will end up in in grass. The cattle eat the grass. They don't eat any more carbon dioxide that is now in carbon compounds in the grass. There's a finite amount. That they then convert into meat, into urine, into dung, into leather. And we extract some of that atmospheric carbon dioxide by sequestering it into the dung and the urine and into leather. So if you are growing cattle for meat or for leather, then it's a net zero process. You're already pulling carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. Now, the attack then has been on methane, which cattle burp out methane, and this is basically the carbon that's come from grass. Some of it ends up as carbon dioxide, some of it ends up as tissue in the cattle, but some of it is burped out as methane. That methane very quickly oxidizes to carbon dioxide and to water vapor. The atmosphere does contain some methane, but the absorption lines of energy for methane overlap with those of water, and methane is already saturated in the atmosphere. So this attack is not an attack based on climate, it's an attack where the green movement is a repository for failed dietitians who want us to be vegetarians and vegans. And it's an attack on the meat industry. And so they are saying, oh, well, you can eat insects or termites, but they don't tell us about the amount of methane that the termites and insects emit, which is absolutely astronomical. So everything that's precious to us in the West, be it our history, be it our education system, be it Christianity, be it our farming practices, be it our industry practices, everything is being attacked. And so we can have two choices. We can mock them, or we can and fight them very hard, or we can lie down and just destroy everything that's taken thousands of years to build up. So I think we're not dealing with nutters. We're dealing with people who are quite evil and whose medium-term aim is to destroy Western civilization and to destroy the democratic process, such that we can have unelected zealots having power over you. And their power is an attack on your freedom.
I totally agree. Thank you, Professor.
Okay, we've got another question from Catherine McBride. Catherine, another question for Professor Plimer.
Yes, so I was wondering if you've been following whether the world is getting greener, which I've seen written down several times, and that also if it's true that plants need less water if they have more carbon dioxide.
Yes, I was going to send you this slide, Stephen. I'm just checking whether I did or didn't, but I was waiting for that question. Catherine, you're quite right. We have had a greening of the planet, and we're able to measure that from satellite imagery. I don't think I sent you that one, Stephen. We're able to measure that from satellite imagery, and that greening of the planet may well be due to a slight increase in the atmospheric carbon dioxide. It's not due to warming, because we've had warming and cooling, and it may well be due to in areas that are used for agriculture due to better fertilizers and better farming practice. But in many unpopulated areas, we have seen a greening of the planet over the last 30 years of satellite measurements. And so you can argue on the basis of this that humans emitting carbon dioxide is wonderful for the environment. It's the exact opposite of what we're being told.
Okay, Don, you got another question, mate?
Thank you. It's more a comment, really. Earlier on, you were talking about how to get the message across to schools. I was recently invited to talk to some primary children just about my background and how I developed from a very low level of background. I'm intending to draw the attention of that school where they teach critical thinking to this video. And I was wondering how easy it would be to find it. I don't use YouTube very often at all. Is it just Professor Plimer on climate change?
Yes, just look up Plimer, climate YouTube, and you'll see a lot of stuff. There's a huge amount of stuff with me. Now, to talk to schools, I think it's a very important duty. I do it a lot. Stephen and I will be later this month at a place where it's going to be it'll be about a 2,500 kilometre drive for me to get there. It's not a school, but it's a group of farm-based people. I talk as much as I can. I talk everywhere because it's a much better way than writing books. Children don't read books. But I find it very hard to get into schools. Teachers have great difficulty with me giving facts. Now, last night I was at a pub having a couple of drinks and a meal before I went to a football game. A woman came up to me and recognised me from television and said, "Could you please give a talk at my school?" Of course, I said yes. So I think that's an extremely important thing to do, to talk to schools. Kids are the video generation. YouTube is a very good mechanism to do this. As a scientist, when I talk, I try not to use jargon. I try not to use anything where you're going to have people change channel or turn off, or kids are going to start to look for a diversion. So it's one of the things I do. I go around talking a lot, and there's a huge amount of stuff with me on YouTube.
Good, thank you. Thank you very much.
Cheers, thank you.
And yes, thank you, Don. I just want to remind everyone who might be watching this later on YouTube or some of the other platforms, if you want to be part of this and you want to be on this call in future, we have some great guests lined up in the next months and weeks coming up. You need to be a subscriber to the newsletter on CIBUK.org, factsforeu.org, or commandingthenarrative.com. Look, Leigh puts out some great information on his two platforms every single day, almost 5 days a week on Facts for EU. He gets on media in the UK because the articles that he's producing are so great. And on Commanding the Narrative, I mean, I've got plenty of articles, stuff that I'm doing, podcasts that we do elsewhere as well. So it's a good way for you to stay up to date with everything that we're doing, but also being able to participate into in these global discussion forums going forward. So please, if you haven't done so already, jump on there now. Those 3 websites, I will put those links in the show notes as well. If you are watching this later, just click on one of them and subscribe to the mailing list, and you can be part of this in the future. But we've got a few more questions to pump out. David?
Stephen, just before you do, yeah, well done on saying that. Just on YouTube, former MEP, member of the European Parliament, David Campbell-Bannerman, has put something up. And you might want to take that one because he's been waiting for a little while. I'm not sure what he's got to say, but that's a possibility. And we've got other people. It's great, isn't it, to have so many questions to such a great, informative speaker. Back to you.
Yes, I mean, this is what the Global Discussion Forum is all about. Having a great speaker, being able to ask questions from a whole range of different people. You would have to be impressed with Professor Ian Plimer. He's answered every question in depth. It's questions from all sides of the spectrum here tonight. He's been able to answer every single one of them. We have another one from David. David, your question?
Yeah, thanks. Ian, I'm not going to try and catch you out on this one, so relax. Going back to the subject of energy supply, I had a letter published in the Times newspaper in London last Monday on the subject of small modular reactors. I was singing their praises and trying to extol their importance in the overall energy supply. Would you agree that they do form a very important and integral part of the way that we are supplied with energy, avoiding other countries supplying us and the vagaries of wind and so on and so forth? Would you agree that they are a very sound and important component in how we get our energy?
Yes, I would. And we've been using small nuclear reactors in submarines and military vessels since the 1950s. This is a well-established technology, and like well-established technologies, they keep improving. We have a great need for small modular nuclear reactors in Australia because we have many industries, mining industry, where you might have a mine operating for 40 years and then you pack up and go. And this is absolutely perfect to use a B double to drive in your small modular nuclear reactors. You probably need about 50 megawatts of power for the mine. And when it's finished, you drive it away and put it somewhere else. So I don't see that that's the answer to a maiden's prayer. It's just one of the flexibilities that you can use if you think of a flexible energy system rather than focusing only on solar and wind. And just to add to Leigh's comments, I do quite a bit of public speaking. I've got a talk in Dublin on the, for you people in the Northern Hemisphere, a talk in Dublin on the 29th of November. The next day, I will be at the Ireland Wallabies rugby game. I'm a bit reticent about that. I think we might get thrashed. And then on the Monday the 2nd, Tuesday the 3rd, and Wednesday the 4th, I'll be in Edinburgh. There will be a talk organised then. I don't know when, but you'll be able to find it sometime. So I do actually go out of my way to talk a lot around the world.
Leigh alluded to the question from David Campbell Bannerman. I've got it here. How do we win the political battle on climate change? What will turn political support away from extreme net zero targets? Is it cost and practicality? Thanks for your courageous and rational leadership on this issue.
I think a lot of people, especially young people, don't understand costs, and that's because they're not earning the money and paying for it. So I think that with the inevitable collapse of our energy system, that will be a wake-up call. I think if I were a politician, I would follow the Trump method, and I would mercilessly take the piss just constantly, because I think the hypocrisy and the nonsense needs to be called out on every occasion. And I think humour is probably the best weapon we've got to use. But I don't envy someone being a politician in the parliament where you have just so many people are obsessed with this ideology and have embraced it like a new religion.
Now, I'm going to squeeze in one final question before we get to Leigh's challenge. I'm waiting for Leigh's challenge, but you've never shied away from your involvement in the mining industry. You're a geologist after all. Can you talk a little bit about lithium mining and cobalt mining? We know a lot of these materials go into the components of solar panels and other renewables. What, people that aren't aware of how environmentally destructive these mining practices can be, especially with the lithium and the amount of water that's taken to mine these materials, and that water becomes contaminated. Can you talk a little bit about that?
I'm what they call an economic geologist or a minerals deposit geologist. My expertise is in mineral deposits. Some of my life has been in the academic world. Some of it's been at various levels in the mining industry, at the middle and upper levels in the mining industry. And as a geologist, where do you expect me to be employed? In a casino or at a race course? I mean, geologists work in mines. Now, next week, I'm going to a cobalt mine to have a look at it. And I think they're looking at mechanisms of financing there. And I've been involved in the lithium industry off and on around the world. Basically, our civilization is as it is because of mining. And that's including mining this sort of stuff. I just picked it up off my desk, a bit of drill core of iron ore deposit, of an iron ore deposit in Western Australia. We are as we are as an advanced society because of mining. We mine energy. We drill holes to get oil and gas. We, in past times, would use stones in the Stone Age, but now we will mine material, we will beneficiate it, we will process it into a concentrate, and then from the concentrate, we'll get the useful material out of it. Now, all of that requires energy. All of that requires digging holes, maybe shifting overburden, maybe processing and leaving processing waste. Mining has in the past been a very dirty business, but the Western world now is wealthy enough where we can afford not to have filthy mines. My concerns with the lithium and cobalt that you mentioned is that we have a lot of restrictions on mining in Western countries, and geology controls where you're going to find that lithium and cobalt. And much of it is in third world countries where the regulatory requirements are not as strong and where bribery is the order of the day. If you want to prance around driving your electric car, telegraphing that you are morally superior to those driving an internal combustion engine, then you have to think again, because an electric car uses a lot of cobalt and a lot of nickel. That nickel is mined in open pits, mining tropical soils, and at the base of that soil, you have an enrichment in nickel. In many of these tropical countries where it's mined, such as in Cuba or New Caledonia, even in Indonesia, the environmental regulations are not very strong, and you can leave an absolute awful mess and walk away. That happened in previous centuries in Western countries, but we now have the regulatory requirement where you can't do it. So you are responsible for a lot of environmental damage if you use an electric car using nickel. But if you're using an electric car using cobalt, it's even worse, because the bulk of the world's cobalt comes from mines in Africa, in the Congo. These mines are run by the Chinese. The employees are children. They work as slaves, and there is a huge fatality rate in underground and open pit failures. So if you're driving an electric car, you're a supporter of slavery, you're a supporter of child labour, and you're a supporter of appalling occupational health and safety conditions. So my concern about the boom in electric cars and the boom in some of these specialty metals is that the source of these are mainly from countries that have a rather weak regulatory environment, sloppy environmentalism, and a lot of corruption. And I don't think it's very healthy for the planet if we go down that path. If you want to build a copper mine in Chile or in Australia or in the US, you have very, very strong regulations, and these go down to the flora, the fauna, the water, the atmosphere, the dust, the sound, the energy usage, and on you go. So even though I am very closely associated with the mining industry, one has to be very careful as to where you operate. And there are certain countries where you just don't operate. It's just not possible to work in those countries without operating using the best practice that we have in Western countries. If we're going down the electric car route, that's going to require a massive increase in the amount of metal that we produce, especially copper. Now, we're successfully mining copper deposits with 0.5% copper in them. That requires a huge amount of tailings that are left behind, and that gives us a huge amount of waste from mining these in open pits. If we are to use more copper, then we're going to be mining lower grades, maybe 0.4% or 0.3%, and the amount of tailings and the amount of waste is going to be even higher. So I'm not so sure it's a very sensible move to use electric vehicles. I'm not so sure it's a very sensible move to use commodities and plan to use commodities which have not yet been found.
That's the big problem with a lot of these things. If you know, on the surface, they're sold as environmentally, saving the planet. They're these wonderful things, but when you scratch beneath the surface, there's a lot of danger behind it all. But Leigh, I'm going to shift to you. You spoke of a big challenge earlier. Let's finish off with that.
Okay. First of all, Stephen, I want to start off with some thank yous, if that's all right. Just like TV shows and films, I want to leave the suspense of the challenge to the end to guarantee our audience. Firstly, obviously, I want to thank Ian. Professor Plimer is probably the best person I know speaking on the other side of the argument about climate change. What a fascinating talk that was. And I think everyone that's listened to it live, I also think all of those that are now going to listen to it on our recorded version on YouTube, when we promote that, will be very, very interested, because Ian, you've provided a voice for an awful lot of people who are mightily concerned about a great number of things. So thank you for giving up your time this Sunday morning, or in fact in your time Sunday evening. Much appreciated. Briefly, I want to say thank you to my good friend and colleague, Stephen, who's done all of the hard yards in hosting today and in fielding all the questions. Trust me, everyone, it's not easy trying to keep tabs between YouTube and Zoom and so on. I think you've done a magnificent job, Stephen. You've got a lot of people in. Thirdly, I want to thank our guests. What a fantastic turnout. Absolutely excellent. And you're just a small fraction of those that are going to be watching this going forward. So thank you for stimulating Ian into some very interesting answers. Next up, I just want to say quickly where we're going next with Global Discussion Forum. I can tell you, since we started it earlier this year, it's going from strength to strength and getting more and more bandwidth out there. Next up, we've got a good friend of mine, Sir John Redwood, who, as some of you will know, is a former Secretary of State, a former Cabinet Minister, brain the size of a planet, a bit like Ian, and he's going to be talking to us on Sunday, the 1st of September at 10 a.m. UK, which I believe, Stephen, you might correct me, I believe that's 7 p.m. Sydney time, AEST. Is that correct?
That's correct.
And if everyone listening to this signs up to either vax4u.org, CIBUK.org, or commandingthenarrative.com, then you will receive invitations with the links going forward. And we plan to do these things about every 3 to 4 weeks, something like that. You will only get top quality speakers like we've had today with Professor Plimer. And I'd like to think that the quality of conversation will be excellent too. Right. I don't think I can put it off any longer, can I? This challenge, which I'm going to drop on our wonderful guest today, which he knows nothing about, by the way. It's out of the blue. Ian, one topic that came up was this lack of public awareness, and it came up. I raised it. A few other people raised it. We all know how important this is. It's all very well us talking about it. And hopefully we'll get this out to many tens of thousands of people. That's what we normally manage to do. But even that isn't enough. So we need to go further. You said during your talk, or in an answer to a question, that you do everything you can and you get some media coverage, but it's not nearly enough. I think Sky News Australia, maybe. And you get articles in the Specky in Australia, the Spectator. I want to go one stage further, because I think you're good enough to do something bigger than that. And I think we can help you to do it. I'm not certain. I haven't run this past the broadcasters yet, but I need to know your answer to a question live on air. And that is this: if I can persuade a TV channel or more than one to cooperate to run a TV debate between you and the best that the other side can put up, would you stand up and do it?
Well, of course, I absolutely love debating. I find in this country that people on the other side don't want to debate me. They think of every possible excuse to avoid a debate. I would regard myself as a polymath, and I'll take on anyone.
Great.
At any time and anywhere. I mean, I would be quite happy to do it from a studio in the UK. I go to the UK enough to be able to organise something like that. So willingly, yep. The answer is yes, in neon lights.
That's fantastic. I warn you, I know quite a few TV producers and presenters, so this isn't an idle threat.
Thank you.
And if we can get you into a studio in the UK, and also possibly do a combined deal with a TV channel in Australia, and maybe one in the States, then we can start to shift the dial of public thinking. And I stay very impartial in all of these things. It's my job to do that. What I don't like is freedom of speech being shut down, which is what I see with people like you, Ian.
That's true.
I think a public debate, getting the messages out there is incredibly important. I can tell you that the organisations I chair, Facts4EU and CIB UK, are non-partisan, but we believe 100% in things like independence, sovereignty, democracy, and particularly freedoms. And certainly my team at Facts4EU believes in freedom of speech. And if we don't make any kind of effort to get your messages out there, then we're not doing our job properly. So if I can appeal to everyone, please support us in doing this if you can. Please recommend us. We desperately need more money to counteract the $5 billion that George Soros has given to the other side of the argument. We get by on basically pocket money. It's like delivering newspapers, the money that we get. So please promote if you enjoyed this. I can tell you, I thoroughly did. And I could tell from Stephen's reaction that he did. So unless anyone else, well, I'll pass back to Stephen in a minute. Just make a note in your diary for Sunday, the 1st of September, 10 a.m. UK, 7 p.m. Sydney time. That again is going to be another fascinating one, different topics, but it's going to be great. So hope to see you all then. Stephen, do you have anything you want to add before I close?
No, I know we've been repeating ourselves over and over again, but we just want to make it very clear. If you want to be part of this, and I think by the accounts of everyone that was here tonight and they got to ask their questions, I'm sure they found it valuable. I'm sure it was a great thrill to be able to ask questions directly to Professor Plimer. And look, as Leigh said, next time we're going to have Sir John Redwood, who was in the British Parliament, I think over 30 years or almost 30 years or so. So the wealth of knowledge that man has is going to be incredible as well. So if you do want to be part of it, we've said it before, I'll say it again, sign up to the newsletters at CIBUK.org, facts4eu.org, or commandingthenarrative.com. One of those three. I encourage you to sign up to all of them, but you only need to be on one of them, and you'll receive the invitation in a newsletter or an email link. So that's the way to be involved if you are watching this after the live stream. And I'll pitch back to you, Leigh, to sign us off, mate, and end the stream.
Yeah, I'm sorry, we're 1 minute late to sign off, but I'm kidding. Most of these things drag on. We try to run them to time. We try to run a tight ship. We try to make them interesting and fast moving. Stephen, I think you've done a magnificent job doing that. Everyone, great to see you all. And I look forward to talking to some of you who know me going forward. But it's been a great event, and look out for this on YouTube. We'll be publishing it. So it's good night from me, and it's good night from him.